Welcome to Guts and Guns, where we break down big ideas and deliver actionable insights, all in just a few minutes. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're firing up a conversation about something really mouth-watering for any grilling fan.
Oh, yeah.
The magic of marbling in steaks.
Definitely.
Why does that, web of white fat make such a massive difference when it hits the grill?
It's a great question. We've looked at some excellent material, mainly from marbling's effect on grilled steaks and some related pieces online.
Right, trying to really get to the heart of it.
Exactly. Because,
Yeah.
that perfect grilled steak, it's kind of the holy grail for a lot of us.
Totally.
And marbling is almost always part of that perfect picture. So our mission today is really to go beyond just marbling's good,
You get into the why.
the why and the how,
Yeah.
the science behind why it makes those grilled steaks just so incredibly good.
Okay, let's jump right in. What exactly is marbling when we use that word?
So technically, it's intramuscular fat, IMF.
IMF. Yeah.
Yeah, and that means it's the fat within the muscle tissue itself. You see it as those little white flecks or streaks. And it's really crucial to separate that in your mind from, say, the big cap of fat on the outside.
Right, the subcutaneous fat.
Exactly. Or the fat that sits between whole muscle groups. That's different too, intermuscular.
Ah, okay. So the key is it's inside the muscle fibers, kind of woven in.
Precisely. And that location is everything for its effect. Our sources often call it white gold
Yeah, I can see why.
because it has such a huge impact on the eating quality. Chemically, it's a mix of fatty acids, polyunsaturated, monounsaturated, saturated.
You're right.
And the interesting thing is, its texture, it's pretty firm when the steak is cold. But as it warms up, say on the counter, or definitely on the grill, it softens, and then it starts to melt.
And I gather not all marbling looks the same or acts the same. The sources mention different types.
Absolutely. Big difference. It really comes down to the texture and the distribution of that fat.
Okay.
So the best type, the most desirable, is fine marbling.
Fine.
Think really thin, delicate little white flecks. And they're spread super evenly throughout the muscle.
Like you see in Wagyu sometimes.
Exactly. Wagyu, Kobe, those are prime examples. And the reason it's so prized is because it melts really quickly and evenly during grilling. So it bastes the steak from the inside very consistently. Leads to that fantastic juiciness and tenderness.
Okay, so fine is the goal. Then there's medium marbling. Sounds like a step down.
It is generally for grilling. With medium marbling, the flecks are bigger, less uniform, not as evenly spread out.
Right.
And because those fat deposits are larger, they just take longer to melt, to render completely.
So if you're cooking it quick, like to medium rare.
Exactly. You might end up with spots where the fat hasn't fully melted. It can feel a bit waxy in the mouth.
Not ideal.
Not ideal.
Right.
And the unevenness means, some bites might be more tender or flavorful than others, less consistent.
And the last one, coarse marbling. I'm guessing that's the least wanted.
Yeah, generally speaking, especially for grilling, coarse marbling, you're looking at large, thick, really uneven streaks or chunks of fat within the muscle.
Okay.
And those problems we just mentioned with medium marbling, they're even worse here.
Takes even longer to melt.
Way longer. It's really hard to get that fat rendered properly in the short time it takes to grill a steak without overcooking the meat itself. Makes getting a uniform texture and flavor very difficult.
So it sounds like the quality of the marbling, how fine and even it is often more important than just the sheer amount of white stuff you see, especially for grilling.
That's a really critical takeaway from the sources. For the relatively fast cooking of grilling, fine, evenly distributed marbling is definitely king.
Makes sense. So what actually causes one steak to have more or better marbling than another? Is it just luck of the draw?
Oh, not at all. There's some pretty well understood factors. Genetics is a huge one.
The breed?
Yeah, the breed of cattle. Some breeds, like Wagyu, as we mentioned,
Yeah.
or Angus, Hereford, Shorthorn, they're just genetically wired to develop more intramuscular fat. They
Interesting.
metabolize their feed differently. And speaking of feed, nutrition is another major factor,
What they eat.
especially what they eat towards the end in the finishing phase. Grain-based diets, particularly high corn diets, tend to produce more marbling than grass-only diets.
Okay, I've heard that debate, grass-fed versus green-finished.
Right. And it's not just the type of feed, but also consistency. You want steady weight gain. If an animal loses weight, that marbling can actually decrease.
Wow, okay.
And then there's age and muscle use. Generally, marbling increases as the animal gets a bit older, up to a point,
Right.
And muscles that don't get used as much, think loin and rib area, where we get our prime steaks.
Ribeyes, New York strips.
Exactly. Those tend to have more marbling than muscles that do a lot of work, like in the legs or shoulder. Those are leaner.
Okay, that covers the what and why it's there. Now, the big payoff, flavor. How does that fat actually create that amazing grilled steak taste?
Well, first off, think of the fat itself as a kind of flavor reservoir.
A sponge, you said earlier.
Yeah, exactly, like a sponge. It absorbs and stores fat-soluble aroma compounds. These come from the animal's diet, what it ate, but also just from its own metabolism.
So there's flavor locked in the fat before it even hits the heat.
Precisely. A baseline of flavor. But then the real transformation happens on the grill, when that fat starts to render, to melt.
Which happens around 130, 140 degrees?
Yep, 130 to 140 Fahrenheit, that's when it really starts to liquefy. And as it melts, it oozes out and permeates the surrounding muscle fibers.
Ah, the internal basting.
That's the perfect term for it. It distributes all those stored flavors throughout the meat much more evenly.
So you get a richer taste in every bite.
A much richer, more evenly flavored bite. But it's not just releasing stored flavors. The heat does more.
Right, you mentioned chemical changes, lipid, something.
Lipid thermal degradation. Fancy term, but basically the high heat of the grill starts breaking down the fat molecules themselves, the triglycerides and phospholipids. And this breakdown creates a whole bunch of new, highly volatile aroma compounds. Things like aldehydes, ketones, alcohols.
The stuff we smell that makes us hungry.
Exactly. Those compounds evaporate, hit our noses, and give us those characteristic beefy, roasted, savory, even sometimes slightly sweet or buttery notes. And the key is, the more marbling fat you have, the more of these volatile compounds get generated. It's a direct relationship, significantly more than in a leaner cut.
Wow. So the aroma is literally new flavors being cooked up from the fat.
A whole symphony of them.
And how does this connect with the sear, the crust? That Maillard reaction everyone loves.
Great question. They work together beautifully. So the Maillard reaction is that browning process. On the surface, amino acids and sugars reacting under high heat.
Right, gives that deep savory flavor.
Yes. Now, some of those volatile compounds we just talked about, the ones created from the fat breaking down, they can actually react with the intermediate products of the Maillard reaction.
Creating even more complex flavors.
Yeah. Exactly. Forming things like heterocyclic compounds, which are major contributors to that cooked meat aroma. Plus, think about the physical effect.
Okay.
That melting fat on the surface can actually help transfer heat more efficiently to the meat.
Oh, interesting.
Which can potentially enhance the browning, intensify that Maillard reaction, leading to an even better crust and flavor profile.
So it's like a tag team for flavor.
It really is. Fat breakdown and Maillard working in concert.
And it seems like this affects how we actually perceive the taste too, not just the compounds themselves.
It does. The sources point out that higher marbling can actually make the steak taste perceived as sweeter.
Sweeter. Huh.
Yeah, and it definitely creates that rich, luxurious mouth-coating sensation. It can also sort of dial down the perception of any sour or acidic notes.
Makes sense.
And studies back this up. They measure higher concentrations of these key flavor volatiles in steaks with more intramuscular fat, like over 10% or so. And that correlates directly with taste panels, rating them as having more intense flavor.
Okay, flavor is clearly a massive win for marbling. Let's switch gears to tenderness. How does the fat make the steak easier to chew?
It works in a few ways. First, just physically. The presence of all that fat woven within the muscle bundles disrupts the dense structure.
Gets in the way.
Kinda. Yeah. It basically means there's less tough muscle fiber and connective tissue packed into the same space compared to a leaner cut.
So it's inherently less dense, less tough to start with.
Exactly. It's like it's already partly tenderized just by being there.
Huh.
Then, when that fat melts during cooking.
The lubrication effect.
You got it. That liquid fat coats the individual muscle fibers. Think of oiling engine parts.
Okay.
Muscle fibers tend to contract and toughen up when heated. The melted fat allows them to slide past each other more easily as you chew, reduces friction.
Makes a huge difference in how tender it feels.
A huge difference. Plus, fat tissue itself is just way softer than muscle fiber.
Right, that makes sense.
It yields much more easily when you bite down. So if a steak has a higher proportion of this soft, fatty tissue mixed in, the whole thing just feels more tender because less of it is offering resistance.
Simple physics, almost.
Pretty much. And there's even some thought that the fat located within the connective tissue sheaths, the stuff holding muscle bundles together, might help weaken those tissues during cooking too. another potential tenderizing effect.
So it really does sound like, as you said, tenderness insurance for the grill.
It's a great way to think about it. Grilling involves high heat, which can easily toughen lean meat through protein denaturation, muscle contraction, moisture loss.
Yeah, drying it out.
Marbling helps counteract all of that. It makes those well-marbled cuts much more forgiving if you accidentally leave it on for an extra minute.
It's less likely to turn into shoe leather.
Much less likely. You have a bigger window for error.
Okay, so flavor, check. Tenderness, check. What about juiciness? That other critical element.
Right, juiciness. And it's maybe not as simple as just water content. Juiciness is really the sensation we get from moisture released during chewing,
Okay.
which includes both the meat's natural water-based juices and that liquid rendered fat. Plus, the flavor and fat stimulate saliva production, which adds to the feeling.
Ah, so the melted fat itself contributes directly to the moisture we feel.
Absolutely. It's liquid in your mouth, adding to the overall sensation of wetness. It intensifies the juiciness beyond just what the water provides.
And does it help hold on to the water too? I know you said searing doesn't really seal juices.
Right, that's mostly a myth. But while it might not trap water in, having all that liquid fat present does seem to counteract the perception of dryness.
Okay.
It coats everything. Some sources suggest it might even slow down the rate at which the water-based juices evaporate from the surface during cooking and resting. But the main effect is adding its own moisture and richness.
And that richness affects the mouthfeel too, right?
Definitely. That's a huge part of it. Rendered fat gives that smooth, luxurious, almost velvety texture. People use words like buttery.
Yeah.
It creates that pleasant, oily coating on your palate and contributes to a longer-lasting finish. It's interesting, sensory panels often perceive juiciness differences related to marbling, even when lab measurements show similar amounts of total moisture squeezed out.
So the type of moisture matters. The fat makes it feel juicier.
Exactly. That fat component really elevates the whole experience of juiciness and mouthfeel.
Okay, this is all clicking into place. Let's connect it to what we see at the store, the USDA grades. Prime, choice, select. How much does marbling drive those?
It's the number one factor. Absolutely critical. When the USDA grader looks at a beef carcass, the amount and distribution of that intramuscular fat, the marbling, is the main thing they assess to determine the quality grade.
More so than age.
Physiological maturity, the age, is considered too, especially for overall quality. But for differentiating between prime, choice, and select, in the younger cattle typically used for steaks, marbling is paramount.
So these grades are essentially predictors of the eating experience based on marbling.
That's the whole idea. They're trying to give you, the consumer, an indication of how tender, juicy, and flavorful that steak is likely to be.
Okay, so walk us through them. If I splurge on a prime steak, what should I expect on the grill?
Prime is the top tier. It has the most abundant marbling, typically described as slightly abundant to abundant.
Lots of flex.
Lots of fine flecks, ideally. Because of that, you can expect the highest degree of tenderness, juiciness, and that really rich, buttery flavor profile we've been talking about.
And maybe more forgiving.
Definitely more forgiving on the grill because of that extra fat. But it's also the smallest percentage of grated beef, maybe 5-10% historically, though it varies. So it's usually the most expensive.
Right. Okay, what about choice? That seems much more common.
It is. Choice is still a high-quality grade, very popular. It has less marbling than prime, ranging from small amounts up to moderate. So choice steaks offer a really good balance. You still get good flavor, tenderness, juiciness, great for grilling. You just might need to be a little more careful with your cooking than with prime to ensure it doesn't dry out.
Makes sense. Most widely available, you said?
By far. The vast majority of beef in grocery stores and restaurants is choice.
And finally, select. What's the story there?
Select grade has the least amount of marbling of the three, just a slight amount, so it's significantly leaner.
Okay.
Because of that lower fat content, it may not have the same richness of flavor or the same level of juiciness as prime or choice. Tenderness can still be good, especially in naturally tender cuts like filet mignon, but
Higher risk of being tough or dry if you're not careful.
exactly. Careful cooking is essential for select. You really don't want to overcook it. Marinating is often recommended for select cuts to help add moisture and flavor.
So if we compare grilling a highly marbled steak, say prime or high choice, versus a leaner select cut, what are the key differences in the outcome?
Okay, flavor-wise, marbled will be richer, more complex, buttery notes. Leaner will taste more straightforwardly beefy, maybe a bit minerally, but less complex.
Texture.
Marbled, generally softer, more tender, that melt in your mouth quality. Leaner, firmer, Potentially chewier, though again, the specific cut matters a lot too.
And juiciness.
Marbled. Usually perceived as much juicier due to all that rendering fat doing its internal basting thing. Leaner. High risk of tasting dry, especially if cooked past medium rare.
It seems pretty clear-cut, but you mentioned earlier the grades aren't perfect guarantees.
Right, that's important to remember. They are strong predictors, probably the best single indicator we have for eating quality related to marbling. But they aren't foolproof.
Why not?
Well, there's variation within each grade. A high-end choice might be very close to a low-end prime. Other factors matter too, the specific breed beyond just potential, how it was fed before the finishing phase, aging.
Dry aging versus wet aging.
Exactly. Aging makes a big difference in tenderness and flavor, and of course, cooking skill.
Yeah, can't discount that.
A well-cooked choice steak will beat a poorly cooked prime steak any day. And sometimes consumer preference doesn't perfectly track with subtle differences in marbling anyway. But overall, choosing a higher grade significantly increases your probability of getting that fantastic tenderness, juiciness, and flavor.
Okay, probability, not certainty. Got it. So you've picked out a nicely marbled steak. What's the best approach on the grill to really nail it, to make the most of that marbling?
The main goal, right, is twofold. You need to render that fat, effectively get it melted and flowing, which starts around 130, 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And to D, you need to develop that delicious Maillard crust on the outside, all without causing huge grease fires or drying the steak out.
Tricky balance sometimes.
It can be. Temperature management is key. Aiming for that medium rare internal temp, like 135 degrees of Fahrenheit, is usually ideal for marbled cuts. It's warm enough to render a good portion of the fat.
If it's cooked rarer, the fat might still be waxy.
Exactly. Too low, and the fat doesn't melt properly. But you also need that high surface heat over 300 degrees Aris, ideally higher, to get the Maillard reaction going quickly for the crust.
Okay, high heat sear. Finish more gently for rendering. But what about those flare-ups from all the dripping fat, especially with prime?
Yeah, that's a common issue.
Yeah.
Two-zone grilling is probably the single best technique.
How does that work again?
You set up your grill so one side has direct high heat and the other side has indirect lower heat. No coals or burners directly underneath.
Okay.
You sear the steak hard and fast over the direct heat to get your crust. Then you move it over to the indirect side to let it finish cooking gently. The fat still renders, but it's not dripping directly onto the flames, minimizing those flare-ups.
Smart. Any other techniques?
Sure. You can use a cast iron pan right on the grill grates or on a side burner.
Ah, contain the fat.
Exactly. Sear it in the pan, the fat renders into the pan, and then you can even spoon it back over the steak to baste it. Incredible flavor.
Oh, nice.
Or there's the reverse sear.
Right. I hear about that a lot now.
It's great for thicker marbled cuts. You cook the steak slowly over low, indirect heat first, letting it come up to temperature gently and rendering the fat gradually. Then, right at the end, you give it a super hot, quick sear on all sides for the crust.
Kind of flips the usual process.
Totally. Works really well for even cooking and great rendering.
And what about those leaner steaks, the selects? Different approach needed.
Yeah, with leaner cuts, flare-ups aren't the main concern. Dryness and toughness are.
So monitor the temp like a hawk.
Absolutely critical. Use a meat thermometer, don't guess. Pull it maybe even a degree or two before your target, as the temp will rise during resting. Marinades, as we said, can help a lot.
Add flavor and moisture.
Yep. And for thinner lean steaks, often a really quick hot sear is all you need. Cook it fast before it loses too much moisture.
Okay. One final crucial step people sometimes skip. Resting the steak after grilling. Why is that so important?
Oh, it's non-negotiable, really. When the steak is cooking, the heat causes the muscle fibers to tense up and pushes the juices, water, and melted fat towards the cooler center of the meat.
Okay.
If you slice into it immediately off the grill, those juices, which are under pressure, just pour out onto your cutting board.
The dreaded gray steak swimming in juice.
Exactly. By letting it rest for, say, 5 to 10 minutes, the muscle fibers relax a bit. That pressure eases, and the juices have a chance to redistribute more evenly throughout the meat.
So more juice stays in the steak when you slice it.
Way more, leading to a significantly more tender and juicy final bite. It makes a world of difference. Don't skip the rest.
Excellent advice. Well, this has been incredibly insightful. It really brings the science behind marbling to life, doesn't it? Understanding why that fat is so prized for grilling.
Absolutely. I think the main takeaway is just how fundamental marbling is for hitting those high notes of flavor, tenderness, and juiciness on the grill. And it's not just magic, it's chemistry and physics happening in the meat.
Right. We talked about the fat-holding flavor, creating new flavors through rendering and breakdown.
How it interacts with the Maillard reaction for that amazing crust.
How it physically breaks up the muscle and lubricates it for tenderness.
And how that melted fat directly contributes to juiciness and that luxurious mouthfeel.
And seeing the connection to the USDA grades helps make sense of the butcher counter, while remembering that our technique on the grill is the other half of the equation.
Perfectly put. The grade gives you potential. The technique unlocks it.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening.
Yeah, maybe next time you're choosing a steak or firing up the grill, think beyond just the cut or the recipe. Think about the marbling you see. How might that affect the flavor? How should you adjust your grilling to get the most out of it? Understanding this science can maybe elevate your grilling from just following steps to really intuitively cooking an exceptional steak.
Maybe even grab a prime, a choice, and a select of the same cut sometime.
Hey, great idea. Grill them side by side using the same method. Experience the difference firsthand. That's putting the science into delicious practice.
Thanks for listening. Stay curious, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.